Hi. In this video, you will learn how to find the second largest element in the given array. Let us look at the input that we are provided with. We are provided with an array of numbers 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. In the given array, we need to find the second largest element in the array that happens to be 40. Another input is given to us 50, 30, 20, 10. The second largest in this case happens to be 30. There could also be a scenario where the elements in the array are all the same. In that case, you need to return negative infinity because there is no second largest in that particular array. So it could be of negative numbers or it could be unordered. In this case, we need to return -2. And if there's only one element within the array, then we need to return negative infinity as there are no enough elements within that particular array. Now let's look at how do we solve this. Let's take each of the inputs one by one and build the code accordingly. So the first time that we are provided is we are provided with the elements 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. These are the elements that are provided within our array. You need to keep in mind each element in the array is present at different index. 0, 1 goes up to 4. So the way we will solve this is we will define a variable called as max, and we'll assume that the value of the 0th index happens to be the largest element or the maximum element in the array. We'll also create another variable called as second max or second large, depending on what your variable name is. And I want this to be the least number possible, so I will consider it to be the negative infinity. So the idea is we want to loop over our array once and then determine which is the second largest element. We want to do it this way because we want it to be the time complexity to be big O of n. I want to loop over it once and then determine the value. So how do we solve this? We will think about looping over this particular array. We'll use a for loop for it. And while we start the loop, let's not start at the 0th index because we've already assumed that to be the max. We will start from the first index. We'll set the value of I to be 1. Now the idea is we want to compare that particular element in the first index with the previous index or with the value of max because I've assumed max to be 10. We'll compare the value at that particular index with max. So we will say something like if a of I is greater than max. So in this case, at the first index, the value is 20. Is 20 greater than 10? Happens to be true. So what we will do is we will copy the value of max into second max. And then the value of max will be this value at that particular ith index. That is, we will now say our second max will be the value of max. And the value of max will now be the array element, the element at that particular given index. So what this does to our code is we are copying 10 to second max and max will now be set to 20. Then we'll increment the value of I. We'll set the value of I to be 2. In this case, I will check the same condition. Whatever the element at the second index, right now the element is going to be 30. Is 30 greater than max? The value of max is 20 because remember we updated it in the previous iteration. Now, because the condition happens to be true, what we will now do is we'll copy the value of max into second max and the value at that particular index, we will copy it to max. So max is now 30. Second max is now going to be 20. Again, we will increment the value of I. I this time will now be set to 3. Now, when the value of I is 3, the value at that ith index is 40. I'm checking is 40 greater than 30, which again happens to be true. So what we'll now do is we'll copy the value of max into second max, that is 30 is copied. And in the max, we will set the value of 40. Again, we increment the value of I. I is now set to 4. At the fourth index, we have the value 50 present. Now we'll check for the same condition. I will now check, is the value of A of I in that particular index 50, is it greater than max, which is at 40? If the condition is true, what we'll now do is we will now make our second max to be 40 and max to be 50. There is no more elements to check for. So we come out of the loop and we are able to find out what is the second max. Now let's implement the code. So what we'll do is we'll declare two variables, one variable called as max, which is going to be the value of the 0th index. And the other variable is going to be called as S max, which is going to be negative infinity. The next thing that we will do is we will loop over our array where we'll set the value of I to be 1 because we've already assumed the value of the 0th index to be max. I less than array.length I plus plus. So we loop over this particular array. What we'll do now here is, and each of the iteration, we will check if the array of I is greater than max. If it is true, then I will copy the value of max into second max, and I will update the value of max to be that particular array element. And then I will return the value of my second max. So when we do this, when I run this piece of code, I'll say node code.js. You can see that we are able to find the second largest element within the array. Now I want you to keep in mind that this approach will only work if your second largest is found before your largest. Now let us say that we have a scenario where the second largest comes after the largest. We cannot expect the output to appear the same way. Here the output is expected to be 30, but we get negative infinity. The reason why we are getting negative infinity is at no point of time will this particular condition ever be satisfied, because each element in the array will not be greater than the first element that we've already determined. That is the reason the negative infinity comes to us. Now, how do we solve or how do we handle this situation? So the way we handle this particular situation is we need to add an extension to our code. So let's see that. The array that we now have is 50, 30, 20, and 10. Now we expect the output to be 30, but what we got was negative infinity because we need to add an extension to our code. Now, since we are already assuming the value of the 0th index to be the maximum, we will now create our second max to be negative infinity. Now, this is a situation where our if statement will always be false, because if you look at this particular array, 50 is the largest element and there is no element which is larger than 50. So our if statement will always be false. Let's see this through the iteration. Now let us say when the value of I is set to 1, the element at the first index is basically 30. So let me write this 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now when I say if A of I is greater than max, then we would want to shift the values. That is, our second max will be max and max will be set to A of I. So what happens is in this if statement, 30, is it greater than 50? The value is false. So my if statement is false. This is my if statement. So my if statement does not work. So there should be another check that I should do. I will also add another else if. The condition that I want to check for is I will now check if A of I is greater than second max. Now looks like the condition is true. A of I is basically 30. Second max is negative infinity. Is 30 greater than negative infinity? True. So what we'll do at that point of time is we will say our second max will be the value of a of I. So our second max, which was set to negative infinity, will now be set to the number 30. So this is what happens in our first iteration. This else if condition is what we also have to take for this edge case. When the value of I is going to be 2, I still have to continue the rest of the loop. When the value of I is set to 2, at the second index, the element is 20. So what I'll now do is, again, I will run this particular check. I will check if a of I is greater than max, which is false. The next condition that I will check for is a of I, which is 20, is it greater than second max? Is 20 greater than 30, which is also false. So I increment the value of I. I is now set to 3. Again, I do the if statement. Is a of I greater than max? At the third index, the value is 10. Is 10 greater than 50? The answer is false. No. The next condition that I'm going to be checking for is a of I, which is 10, greater than 30? This is also false. And then we come to the end of the array. There is no more elements to check. So we find the second largest element, which happens to be 30. So let's extend our loop where we will now say else if array of I, that is the element of that particular index, is it greater than second max, then our second max will be set to array of I. So now you can see that when I run this piece of code, earlier we had got negative infinity. Now when we run this piece of code, then it is going to return the output of 30. But then there is also another check that we need to do. That is, what if there are all the elements which happen to be the same? Here, the value is all 10. Now, when I run this piece of code, it'll give me the output. The second largest happens to be 10, which is not true because all the elements happen to be the same. So all that we need to do is when all the elements are repeated, since there is no second largest, we are supposed to be returning negative infinity. The way we can control that is we will add an AND operator, and we'll also say that, okay, if you want to copy the value of array of I into second max, firstly, array of I should be greater than second max, which is true for us. And we'll also say that array of I should not be equal to our max. So here in this case, what will happen when I start the looping and from the first index, our AR of I is 10. Then S max is negative infinity. So this condition is true. And ARR of I happens to be 10, which is max is also 10. So this condition fails. So this never is going to be assigned. When I run this piece of code, now this gives me the output of negative infinity. When I have it for this, I should get the output of -2. And when I run this, I should get the output of negative infinity once again. So as you can see, we are now able to successfully find the second largest element in the given array. So let me briefly speak about what this particular condition is doing. Now this condition is when all the elements within our array happen to be the same. So when I have 10, 10, and 10, we know that max will be set to the first element in the array, and our second max is set to negative infinity. So in this case, is 10 greater than, and when we set the value of I, when we start performing the loop, the value of I is set to 1. The value of this ith index is basically 10. Is 10 greater than 10? False. Again, is 10 greater than negative infinity? True. And is 10 not equal to 10? This is false. So since I'm using an AND operator, this condition happens to be false. So that's why my else if statement never gets executed, because all the time 10 will be equal to 10. Hence, this will be false. We don't enter the else if statement. Hence, whatever the value of second max, negative infinity, is what is returned from our program.